Hi, this is Pierre Sabak, and today I'm going to be speaking to the filmmaker Chris Turner. Now we're going to be looking at his history of films and all the different people that he's interviewed. So the first question that I've got is basically, I know your work through Don't Mention the Reptiles.
We consider you important, John. You're not special. You're not the chosen one. You're not the savior. But you're a hell of a journalist, which is good for us. Bad for you. What, you think this story was your idea? We needed to trigger you. That's what we do, John. We poke you, prod you, coerce you, make you do things we can't. Well, not openly anyway. For now, just know, some of us are trying to help. You got a friend in me.
And I just want to say that this is a fantastic film. I think what's interesting for me about this piece of filmmaking is that it combines high concepts and high visuals in terms of that it tells a story. And so there's a thread or a story which runs through this. And then in between the storyline, there are interviews with lots of different authors, such as James Bartley, who I've managed to interview, luckily. Also David Icke and lots of other high profile authors. So my question to you is, did you start out as a filmmaker, or were you principally a person who was interested in making documentaries and interviewing people? Because looking at this film, it's very difficult to know whether you were interested in more moving into, let's say, cinema and cinematography and directing sort of conventional pieces, or whether you were more interested in the actual subject matter and interviewing people. And as I said, I think that the film itself is a very interesting juxtaposition of the two strands of filmmaking.
Don't Mention Reptilians came about through back before that. I think it was probably about 2009, maybe 2010. I myself and a few friends had made a film called 1984 The New World Order, and one of my close friends was very interested and very into David Icke's research at that time. I mean, the only time I'd ever heard of David Icke was once on a Channel 4 program where he was being interviewed, and the concept of the whole reptilian thing. But even when I remember when first hearing that, I always thought, and I don't even know why, when I first heard his concepts about the reptilian ETs or interdimensional reptilians or serpents, it never sounded ridiculous to me. And I had an interest in UFOs, but only sci-fi and pop culture. Nothing. I wasn't researching. I wasn't even reading at that time. So that 1984 New World Order was the first time I went to the Isle of Wight and met David Icke. And even though that film is not necessarily, we barely touch upon the reptilian subject, that was the most interesting part of it, because the 1984 type George Orwell concepts that we were looking into and discussing with David at that time, they're quite negative, aren't they? And there's no getting away from that. I think, particularly for a young film, well, I was younger then, just in my 30s, late 20s. I was looking at that and I was shocked. It's, you take the lid off the box and you look inside, and you are quickly overwhelmed. You're fascinated but overwhelmed with this web of deceit, essentially, that mankind has fallen under, or has been manipulated into, shall we say. So it was the first time that I had off camera to discuss a few of the reptilian concepts, and at that time I'd seen a couple of YouTubers. At that time it was a very interesting platform. It was much more diverse, in my opinion, in this genre. There were a lot of young indie filmmakers and just YouTubers just talking about information. And one of the videos that I saw was a long, I think it was about a 3-hour film in about 10 parts. It was called Plausible Points for the Reptilian Case. And that sort of brought together elements.
Sorry about that, Chris. Fingers crossed. Hopefully
Okay.
Everything's going to run smoothly. This has never happened before, but there you are. I mean, this is what happens when you mention the reptiles, isn't it? So Okay, just to recap, basically, your first film was 1984, in which you met David Icke, and you did that film with a group of friends, and he spoke about the reptiles, but not necessarily in great detail, but it was more in context to the New World Order. You also mentioned that you found his information very plausible. Was that just because he was fairly detailed and academic in his research? He's extremely thorough, isn't he? And again, his research encompasses witnesses, and there's anecdotal stories, and it's combined together with symbology. So it's actually, his text is very rich, it's very layered. Myself, I've been very much influenced by David Icke's work, but I also read a book by Professor Robert Temple, and it was called Sirius Mystery. And this was looking at the Dogon tribe and their beliefs of this reptilian race, which had, shall we say, intervened within human history. And so it was really a combination of those two pivotal texts for me, which really made me think, well, the reptile thing could actually be something which was plausible or real. Again, I think I was open to things like UFOs because as a child I'd seen a rocket in a field, and
Yeah, yeah.
so my interest had been piqued because obviously that was something that I couldn't explain. And so I started to look into the symbology of a reptile, and it's absolutely pervasive. It's absolutely everywhere. So that was really the lead into, you don't mention the reptiles. Was that just because you wanted to then really look at the reptilian issue in a little bit more depth? And how did that start exactly?
Well, from that initial meeting in the Isle of Wight, where we discussed these concepts, you can imagine on the way over to the Isle of Wight on the ferry, and it's a long journey from Manchester, as you can imagine. As a group of friends, we'd been discussing these concepts, and it was obviously we were split right down the middle. You had the guys that were really seriously into the politics and the satanic worship and all that side of it. But then you had myself and a friend of mine called Lee, who had been researching heavily into a friend of mine called Ellis Taylor, who delved very deep into this, both quite academic in their approach, if you like, but also spiritual as well, which is something that at that time I was, severely lacking, you might say. So I just knew after that initial meeting, the first step for me was to then get into ufology, because I knew that must have a fundamental part in this jigsaw, if you want to call it that. And I was faced with that taboo, and it was the taboo nature of this subject, where you would have the very, very well-known ufologists completely ignoring these cases. And I was looking back at people like Alex Collier, Barbara Bartholic, Carla Turner, who had done some research in the 90s, particularly a book called Masquerade of Angels, which was about a psychic medium called Ted Rice, and an incident he had with his family. And Carla herself was an abductee and had some experience with the Serpent Reptilians. So that story in particular, Carla and Barbara Bartholic were specialized in screen memories. It was one of, and still is, a very controversial part of ufology, as you know, the alien abduction scene. Obviously we're dealing with anecdotal evidence. Nevertheless, we're dealing with witness cases, millions of these now worldwide. So when I read that Ted Rice's story, that after peeling back layer upon layer of these screen memories, behind the grey aliens were these serpents, and that happened time and time again. And in dealing and then contacting the actual witnesses in the accounts, that's when it started to become very real for me. And again, none of the mainstream ufologists would touch it. They just did not want to know about it. And David had already warned me about that. He'd had a conversation with Zecharia Sitchin, and he had been warned about the subject. Now, in what context that conversation was held, I'm not sure. I've also had associates, shall we say, that have been told about Sitchin's association with the CIA. So obviously, this, you can't take any of this too serious. This is like third, fourth hand information, but it's very interesting when you put all the pieces together and you look at this, and there is no debating that there is people are going out of the way to make this subject very difficult to look into. Even now, when you search in YouTube, all the reptilian material, other than the surface stuff from things like Ancient Aliens, even though, you know, the tongue-in-cheek stuff and the sensationalist type stuff is still in there, but that's the only stuff that's in there. None of the darker stuff associated with this. I mean, there's a few bits on the Dogon tribe, but a lot of this is History Channel stuff that just skims the surface. But there's enough there to whet anyone watching this that's new to the subject. There is enough there to whet your appetite. It was really the taboo that really forced me down the road, and it didn't take long to become, you know, possibly, you know, it's really the subject that I look into the most and that I'm most interested in. And even now, again, with YouTube, where you'll get fact checks on reptilians, and then you'll get some little spiel about these are fictional entities. And I mean, what is the need for that? All right, there may not or may not be some conspiracy there, but all these little things and there's also something just in me that, like, as I said, the first time I heard the statement about David Icke, I think he was on a Channel 4 program called Richard and Judy at the time. You may remember it. Just that concept just stuck with me. And after the David Icke thing, you watch the interviews with Credo Mutwa, who's the Zulu shaman, and he talks about the Zulu culture and the two reptilian brothers, and the creation myth behind all that, and that creation myth and the Zulu, the two brothers, that's not the only culture that sits into either. It's not just part of the Zulu culture. This is going on in cultures across the world. And then you've got the beings from the inner earth, which is another, as I said, this, and I think you say so in your books, this subject is more than just like what the mainstream wants us to think are reptilian space aliens, you know, coming from one particular planet or a distant planet. There is a lot more to this. And as you say, these beings that have learned to deconstruct reality, these are the guys, in my opinion, that we're dealing with, and others, and other factions of. But yeah, so I mean, it's a fascinating subject that it's a strange one, really. On the surface, when I first got into it, I thought there's not a lot here, but now, 10 years later, there is piles of information. You just need the inclination to want to find it out, and you need to speak to a lot of the right people, and unfortunately, some of the wrong ones. So it's been quite a journey to get here.
Just out of interest, do you see these entities as being extraterrestrial or interdimensional, or is it really a combination of the two?
I think I would go down the lines of, yes, these entities are extraterrestrial, if that's the right term, but yet the technology allows them and facilitates the travels into other dimensions. If that's again, I'm not a physicist.
I personally think that's the most logical and the most plausible conclusion from the evidence that we have, which is very wide and it's extremely diverse. Yeah, I'm kind of very interested in the way in which you actually made the film, because it's not a very obvious way of doing it, because in terms of, you tell a story and it's almost like an X-Files story in terms of this young journalist trying to deconstruct and understand what's happening in the world. And he has this whistleblower, and this whistleblower is giving him these really interesting pieces of information, and it turns out that this whistleblower is actually a shape-shifting reptile, and he reveals himself and he's saying, well, we rule the world and we are part of the control system. And you have these little sequences, and they're kind of dotted throughout the film, and it's almost each one ends on a cliffhanger. And then you have an interview which is related to what has been said before, and then you move on to an interview, and then there's another sequence. And I thought that was a really interesting and a very creative way of telling a story, but also introducing very complex and very abstract ideas, but also doing it a way in which it was creative and in which it was very visual. And it was actually really well done. You know, it was almost like you could see something like that on an episode of the X-Files. and it was extremely well written as well. And I believe that you wrote the sequences, or that you co-wrote those sequences.
Yeah, I wrote it, and it was really the journalist character was me. That was sort of my journey, but the way it was told was based on the film from, I think, a film from the 90s, Interview with a Vampire, I think it's called, the one with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. And it just seems like such a fascinating idea to have this vampire that's lived, for ages, just sit with this modern day journalist or investigator. And I thought that fits perfectly. That's exactly how we should do it. But also, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Lacerta files, which is allegedly, this is a female reptilian that was allegedly interviewed by a Norwegian researcher, and he transcribes this whole interview, and she gives a lot of information about the reptilian race. Now, I think that's a work of fiction. Personally, I can't prove that, because I searched high and low to find the creator of that material. Now, the interesting part of it is I could never find him. I got as far as a guy in Norway, but not the guy. And now, obviously, the sensationalist part of this story is that this guy's gone off grid and he's disappeared. However, with a story like this, you always expect that guy to turn up, don't you? Particularly now, because it's kind of in the reptilian, in ufological lore, the Lacerta files are pretty well known, and it's one of those interviews it has to be written by a guy that knows his stuff. Let's put it that way. But it wouldn't be impossible to do. In fact, if I was to do it now, I could do it much better. But nevertheless, it was a fascinating concept, and a concept that I wanted to thread throughout the film. The naming of the film, Don't Mention the Reptilians, was coining two phrases together from Alex Collier, which is a famous, an infamous 80s and 90s ufologist. Alex is still around, actually. He was one of the guys that were willing to look into the reptilian subjects, and he was warned about talking about it many times. Another guy was James Bartley, and of course David Icke. So Don't Mention the Reptilians was apt, really, because he, particularly within mainstream ufology circles, it was exactly that. We don't talk about this here. If you want to talk about that, you're now not invited to come and lecture. And that's what happened to James Bartley, who appears in the film, and he's a little bit of a mentor in this subject for me. He started, and as well as Alex Collier, found themselves relegated to, from the bigger conferences, because it was deemed just either so taboo or, in some cases, ridiculous. But I think it always held a fascination with people in ufology. And I think now, because I track social media and I look at trends within ufology, you can now openly talk about this subject, and there is no longer raised eyebrows from people that have either read your work, David's work, looked at Alex Collier's old interviews, and James Bartley, people like Barbara Bartholic, Carla Turner. There's not many people looking into this subject at all. But I think it is one of those subjects. I think it's just something, I don't know, internal. It's just something annoying. I don't know what it is. I just feel, I've always felt it from that first meeting with David. I've always felt, and then obviously reading bits of science and looking at little bits of what's the guy's name? Dale Russell, who did the thought experiment about what would have happened to the dinosaurs after the asteroid hit. What would have happened if they retreated underground? What would have happened if they evolved like we would have over this period of time? And that was another thread throughout the cultures, that these entities, sometimes the ant people or the greys, or some basically an extra or terrestrial race, you could even say, live inside the earth. And these are deemed to be two different groups, at least two different groups. But I thought that concept alone was very, very interesting. And then, as I say, it's so complex. You can get into Admiral Byrd's logs and all that stuff with I can't remember the name of the project now. But the trips to Antarctica, the work with the Germans, I mean, it goes on and on and on. And, you know, I think you need more people looking into this stuff because there's so much to pick at. It's just absolutely a fascinating subject.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think also in terms of the reptilians, in terms of the jinn are often represented as serpents, and in the old Semitic, the word gen is a serpent or a worm, and again, jinn is a spirit. The implication is that this is these are beings which are invisible, or that they are sometimes invisible, and again, they come from a realm which is parallel to our realm and is very close to our realm. And so, and they can traverse and come across into our dimension. And so these are interdimensional beings. And again, the representation of the jinn as being light is very reminiscent and very similar of the Erin, the Watchers or the Shining Ones, which are cognates of the Elohim, which are the high ones or the gods. And again, you're seeing that there is this relationship in the Greek between theos, a god, theros, a watcher, phos, which is light. But essentially the jinn, which are these beings of light, and again, different people have related this to, let's say, plasma or spirit or and these type of metaphors, but again, are related to the seraphim, because Sopheth, a watcher, is related to Seraph, which is a serpent, Serapha, which is fire, and again, this symbology very much interconnects with the symbology of Sirius. Sira is the Shining One. So the Shining One is where the jinn originate from. Sopheth, a watcher, Seraph, a serpent, Seraph, a fire. Or we could say the Erin, which is a watcher or a Shining One, which are cognate with the Elohim, or as I said in the Greek, Theos, a god, Theros, a watcher, Phos, which is light. So again, it is complicated because there's an astrotheological symbolism in terms of the reptilians and how they relate to Sirius, but then there's also an interdimensional aspect which is accepted within the traditions. And again, even when you look at, let's say, the Arabic etymology of Sirius, Sira, Sarah, which is a spark, hence Serapha, which is fire, but the connotations of Sira, it's a special type of wordplay. It's a diptych paranamesi, and so it converts from the Arabic, from Sira, which is the Shining One, to the Hebrew word Sira, which is a boat. And so there is this tradition that the seraphim, which can be represented by fire, which is equated with Sira, the Shining One, is correlated with these angelic boats or vessels, which is the scaphological tradition, which I write about within my research. And again, it's a very niche area because it's not really, no one is talking about this. And I think this is what's really fascinating, is that when you go into the classical tradition or into religion, nobody talks about, well, yeah, the messengers were related to boats. But in actual fact, when you look at the classical tradition, it is based upon this classified tradition, and it is based upon this tradition of these angelic boats and these vessels. And so when we look at ufology, it's something which is absolutely ancient. I think a lot of people look at ufology as just being this modern phenomenon, in terms of that it just arose out of the technological age. It was almost like a mythology which was arose out of modern technology, but it actually goes back into the ancient world, and it goes back to the occult tradition. So when you're dealing with angels, you're also dealing with these angelic boats and vessels, which they were typically represented as shields or wheels. And so for me, that was something very interesting. And my, if you like, introduction into that was not through other people's work. Yes, people like David Icke and Robert Temple, they piqued my interest because it was like, wow, you know, they're talking about something and that's really interesting, but yeah, can I validate that? Can I prove that? It sounds plausible, but there's a lot of ifs and buts. And is there anything that I can add to that? And is there any information? And so my introduction into this was through symbolism. And so then I started studying etymology and studying the ancient languages like Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew. And I just found out that there was a wealth of information which was encoded in language I refer to this as the artifact, which is this alien code within language, which is found throughout all languages. And so there's this code running throughout human languages. And that's something that's I speak about in my work. I want to just talk about some of your other works as well, because from going on from Don't Mention the Reptiles, I think, did you say your second film was Bringing Down the Light, was it? Or was it EIusive?
Yeah, well, off the back of Don't Mention the Reptilians and the sort of feedback that I was getting from other researchers, people interested in the subjects, the next thing I did, I arranged a conference called RepCon, and that was specifically about the reptilians. And the interest in that was again, in a very, I only had a few weeks to arrange this, but the interest around it, again, I sort of knew, I knew we were that I was onto something with the film and the subject, and then the feedback, then people wanting to do it, and now people are calling for yet another conference that specializes in this subject. So it got a little bit overwhelming, I'll be honest, because you're getting witness accounts from all over, but obviously in this subject you can't validate that. You're in a situation and in a position where you're really going off trust with a lot of this, and there's a lot of discretion and there's a lot of discernment needed in this when you become sort of like a trusted person in a genre, if you want to say that. So I sort of ended up dipping out of the subject for a short period of time, and that's kind of when these films and documentaries ideas come along. Sometimes I feel that that's a little bit deliberate. I know people are going to think this is very conspiratorial, but throughout the making of that film, there are a lot of strange things going on that, I mean, people had warned me about, oh, you shouldn't really delve into this subject. And whilst there was nothing openly sinister or about those events that happened to me and with associates and relationships, there was too much going on for it. I think now for it to be a coincidence, but obviously this is something that you can't prove, and obviously I'm slightly biased because I'm the guy in the situation. So I ended up delving into the cryptid scene over here in the UK through another chance meeting with a witness that had seen a cryptid, actually what she described as a Bigfoot in the UK back in the early 80s. And it was another reptilian moment, if you like, where nobody was touching this subject in the UK. There was the 14 Society, but they had their own opinion about it. And that's a little bit, not cliquey, but it's a little bit niche, especially for a filmmaker coming in, because I think whenever you walk into a subject and you're the new guy, of course, people are going to be quite, distrustful of you. What are your motives? All the rest of it. So it took time to then build a relationship with that community then. And I realized that there were dozens and actually hundreds of people over the years, up until today, that are seeing upright bipedal cryptids in this country, whether it be those fitting a Dogman or Werewolf description, or those fitting a Bigfoot Sasquatch type description. And again, this was like a little bit overwhelming at first, because I just thought, what I've opened yet another can of worms here, because once you then establish yourself, you then get in it starts happening again. You become the guy or one of the guys that people come to with that information. So again, it's been really quite a journey, because on that journey I met your friend of Paul Sinclair's, and he's a guy over in Yorkshire, that he was getting reports of werewolves in that neck of the woods on the east coast there, up near Bridlington, in and around northeast Yorkshire. So that year or two, maybe 18 months, where I wasn't looking at the ufology so much, and I was looking at the cryptid research, again, was a very steep learning curve, but a fascinating one nevertheless. So yeah, I mean, I met some amazing witnesses, and actually one of the cryptid accounts was a reptilian entity seen by a young boy. So, I mean, I don't know how that happens or why should it be in there, but it just, again, sort of something that I'd almost I'd shut the door on it part-time, but it just, it was always within me to do a sequel. I mean, I still get emails to this day, when's the sequel coming out? When's the sequel coming out? And I know you and I recorded before the virus hit, we were recording your interview for part 2. And part 2, whilst part 1, I don't mention the Reptilians part 1, I wanted that dramatic element into it, because I wasn't really sure how to piece that together, to be honest, because it's such, I didn't want to make it one reptilian witness after another, and I also didn't want to make it the David Icke show, and that was the interesting part of this stuff. I needed a way to get to the people that didn't really like David Icke. I needed a way, artistically, if you like, into it, and a lot of people have said that's what did it for them. I mean, it was done on a shoestring. It was just filmed in a mate's apartment, and it's just a conversation. It was, it didn't really cost any money at all. It's just time. But I've always wanted to do part 2 and throw some money at it. Do a little bit more, have a bit more artistic license with it. But I'm not necessarily sure whether it's needed. Just because now I'm a little bit more versed. I've met you, and there are a few more researchers now, and a lot more witnesses come forward. So I don't know whether it needs it. It'd be fun to do it. But at the moment, I'm concentrating on getting the interviews and the content together for part 2. To really tell, because your work was sort of like the eureka moment for me. The minute I saw it, the minute I heard your first interview, I just thought this was what I was looking for, like 5 years ago. It's the missing element of it, and not just within the reptilian genre, within ufology. I think it's the missing. I think a lot of people, when they hear this and see your stuff, it is going to blow the minds. That's what it did to me.
It blew your mind. Well, it's interesting that you say it's the missing link, and I agree. Scaphology, which is the study of these angelic boats within religion and mythology, is the missing link. But when we talk about the missing link, we think about evolution. But when we look at the scaphological tradition, these angelic vessels are spoken about and are represented as wheels. And in fact, this is because they are the UFO itself is constructed from a series of interlocking cogs, so they're very cleverly constructed together. And so the missing link within human evolution is not a genetic missing link. The missing link are these opening wheels, which are represented as a series of links. And again, so even running, let's say, throughout evolution and running throughout ufology, there's a lot of occult symbolism. So within ufology itself, the symbolic element is extremely important, and that's something which needs to be deconstructed as well. So, for example, people like Adamski, Adam Sky, very simple. So again, you're seeing symbolism which is being overlaid in the same way as I'm writing a book about fairies, and again you can see that the priestcraft has overlaid this symbolic language over the fairy tales, which again goes back to this scaphological tradition between the fairies and fairy, which is a boat. In the Semitic traditions, you've got the seraphim and Safina, which is about Saphira, which is a sphere, which is going back to the angelic wheels, which can be represented as shields. So again, everything is very layered. It's extremely nuanced, and this is the difficulty within ufology, because ufology is almost like deconstructing the Bible. Is that there's this body of text, and a lot of it is mythological. A lot of it is based upon this ideoglossolalia, which is this private discourse. It's this hidden way of speaking and this hidden way of codifying information. So you've got the inner and the outer mysteries within ufology. And so just a lot of the old stuff and a lot of what we take for granted within ufology itself needs to be deconstructed as a text. This is something which is known technically as semiotics. I refer to this as Illuminautics, which is the deconstruction of the symbology of the Illuminati. As we said before, the Illuminati are the shining ones, which goes back to the seraphic tradition, which are these serpents or seraphim. So that's something that I'm very interested in looking at. So obviously, you see this as all being interrelated. And again, I think because I've watched all your videos today, because I really wanted to get into your mind and to try and understand your perspective. And what I find is very interesting about the reptilians and the cryptoids is that they seem to actually interlink. And so you are looking at a spiritual or an interdimensional component. You're also looking at a physical component, and you're looking at the juxtaposition of the two. And I think that's really the difficulty within the analysis, isn't it? Is how do the two actually overlay? And this is also in terms of this is difficult just in terms of looking at human metaphysics as well. So for instance, people have deconstructed the anatomical structure of the body, but yet we're still debating whether there is a soul or a spirit. And this is really the same type of thing that we are discussing within the cryptoid information. But really, you know, when we look into, and I was watching James Bartley in his interview today, and he was talking about dream hacking, and I thought that was very interesting, just in terms of my research, because I've done a lot. Well, I have written a book which I haven't published called The Soul Pattern, and that book looks at dreams, and it looks at the idea that the dream realm is the imaginal realm, and the imaginal realm is the spiritual realm. And so dreams are very important because they are, if you like, they are the ulterior, they are behind reality. And if you can control your dream, then you have control over physical reality, and they're very much correlated. So in terms of learning how to control your dream, it's very important, because when you die, you go back into the realm of ideas, which is this imaginal or spiritual realm. And so it's very easy for the soul to be lost within the imaginal realm, in the same way that when you dream, it's very easy for one to be lost within the dream. You get carried away with the illusion of the dream. And so I thought that it was very interesting that he was talking about these beings within the dream realm. And again, that would suggest that they have control over the spiritual mechanics of reality. But I actually think that the spiritual and the physical are very closely interrelated together. They're one and the same. And so, for instances, let's say beings which can, let's say, traverse different star systems, then they need to be interdimensional. And if they're interdimensional, then they have deconstructed the realm of ideas and the spiritual realm, because they've deconstructed time, and they've also deconstructed the realm of space as well. And the realm of the interrelationship between ideas and how ideas are manifested physically. And so that for me is very interesting. Anyway, that was I'm just going off on one. But coming back to your work, was there a project which you really found, let's say, did you have a favorite project, or do you have you know, or did you just find them all very interesting but in different ways?
I think they're all interesting in their own way, but yet they all, as you just stated there, they all contain the same element, which again, that is that coincidence? I don't think so. There are too many coincidences in what I've been doing and what other researchers are doing. And just you talking about dream hacking and the, you know, that sort of like the MK Ultra type research, the Montauk projects, you know, the number of insiders that have come forward with this. Then you've got the reptilian abductees themselves that talk about the MyLab experiences and the compartmentalization techniques and all that stuff. I mean, it's almost been like I've been pulling little bits of information from everywhere. And whilst I'm not in any way academic at all, I can sort of construct in my mind, I am constructing this this story, if you like, of how this all connects. And obviously we're all trying to do that, but I think through the filmmaking process, I've been lucky enough to connect with people that would probably never have met, but yet have shared information with one another that's helped both parties, that they've been able to take some interesting correlations from subjects that seemingly should not be related at all. So yeah, I mean, the favorite subject, it always has been. The minute that the reptilian subject is the thing that I'm really into. And I think the fact that I were into, just like They Live was always one of the movie They Live was one of my, with Roddy Piper, was one of my favorite B movies. And the story behind They Live, I mean, I think Roddy Piper was quoted as saying it was a documentary. It wasn't a movie. It was a documentary, this. And sadly, Roddy Piper's no longer with us, but just that movie and the message in it, obviously it's quoted, throughout from people in the reptilian genre, quote that movie line after line, because it's so relevant to what is happening. So my favorite thing, but I love the reptilian subject, is definitely the one that, to me, it's the direction I think that I've always been heading in, if you like, because it is, I know doors have opened and people's minds have slightly opened to the topic, but there still is a taboo associated with it. You will still, things like MegaCon and the big conferences, your headliner's not going to be talking about this, and he really should be. That this is what we really should be talking about. I mean, I don't think that's a matter of time, personally. But yeah, I think that's the direction that this subject's moving in, if they allow it.
Yeah, again, when we go back to the ancient world, they were talking about entities with tails and serpentine beings. And then within ufology, then the switch moved towards, let's say, grey aliens. And again, when you look at the word greys, there's a word play on gaze and glaze or gloss, which is to shine. And so that works out in the Semitic language. We're in a watcher or a shining one, which we said were theos, a god, theros, a watcher, phos, which is light. So again, it seems to me that we're talking about the same thing, but again, it is interesting how the ufology community has placed their emphasis upon grey entities as opposed to the reptilian, where in the ancient world the emphasis was more on the reptilian beings. And so do you think that it's being co-opted, or is it just that there's just more information on the greys because the greys they're just abducting more people? I mean, do you have a take on this?
Yeah, I think the grey issue is, I think most ufologists now would agree that the greys are the heavy lifters. They're nothing more than associates, tools, pawns to get a job done. And it seems to me, I mean, not just off the back of the work of Barbara Bartholomew that Carla Turner and James Bartley and those guys were doing back in the late 80s and early 90s, but it seems to me that there's been such an effort to hide it. And I get the feeling the beings themselves are behind this. I really do. I know that might, again, to people new to this subject, it is going to seem a bit wild, but I think after like 13, 14 years now of being in and around the subject, and people like yourself that have heavily researched it, I just don't think you can get away from this. It seems to me that I'm not even sure, like, there's a lot of years ago, I wasn't aware of the level of deceit amongst these alleged different races of what people in the community would call extraterrestrials. We'll call them races of beings for now, but I don't even know whether that is legitimate. I think when we start talking about hundreds and hundreds of different ET races, obviously within the size of our universe and other universes beyond, yes, of course, that's plausible. But within the abduction phenomena, I don't think we've got hundreds and hundreds of different entities. That's certainly not what my research tells me. That's not what my witnesses are telling me, nor are they telling other researchers that are like-minded. Now, you'll be aware that there is a love and light brigade within ufology, and I think that's inevitable with anything. I think you have to have balance, and I think to some degree it's required. But I think there is certainly a bias where often a lot of these experiences with the serpent race or the reptilian race, a lot of these experiences are very negative. And as I said earlier, there is a huge effort to hide the identity of the abductors. Now, with the love and light beings, there is none of that. You know, there is none of that. It's, hi, we're the blonde, blue-eyed guys. We're here. What can we help you with? Yeah, I mean, the whole positive ET contact agenda is very suspect. That's not to say that it isn't happening. I think it probably is. But I just think, given the situation that we here on this planet find ourselves in at the moment, the state of the world, I think those good guys don't appear to be in charge. And the agendas...
I completely agree. I mean, again, it is difficult, just because when I look at the human race, you can look at people who are very beautiful, very giving, very compassionate, and then you've got the extreme in terms of serial killers, and you've got wars, you've got famine, and you've got everything in between. So if you said that human beings were horrible, psychopathic, yeah, you'd be telling the truth. If you said that they were wonderful beings and spiritual and compassionate, then also you would be telling the truth. And in actual fact, our species is very complicated, because it's everything in between as well. And I do wonder with these beings whether it's the same with these beings.
Possibly.
But again, I think you may also have, you see, if these beings are using, let's say, AI and artificial intelligence, and let's say that they're all wired up to the same program, then they're going to be very robotic. So again, it depends on whether these beings have integrated themselves with their technology, because that will affect the way in which they think and the way in which they act. And again, whether some of these beings are, let's say, integrated with the technology, and some of the beings from the same species are not. Now, whether that's a protocol within their species, or whether that is something which is different, like the renegade, it's very difficult to know. We could only just possibly speculate on that. So again, I think it's extremely complicated. I do think that there are some very negative beings there, and I think we've got definite evidence of that in terms of animal mutilations, and even worse in terms of humans as well. That's not very good. But then also, we've also got you know, we've got interactions which are, shall we say, a little bit more neutral, that they don't necessarily seem to be bad or good. But then, absolutely. But then we've also got the problem that we know that they are masters of deception. And
then this is you're absolutely.
And so this is the problem. You know, if a being is telling you that it's love and light, and yet it can hide its appearance, and it can control what you think and put thoughts into your mind, then how much of that can you trust? And again, what is the agenda? And so we need to be very cautious about that as well. And so it is a very complicated subject in terms of that. And this is it, isn't it? That all sides are often pitted up against each other, and yet there's an element of truth in all of the sides. And
absolutely, I think you've said, and you have written that is the way that this is done. It's the information is there. You just need the eyes and the mind to be able to sort of deconstruct it, if you like. Because particularly with ufology as well, I don't know whether you've noticed, but the emphasis has never been on the abduction. It's never been, and that has sort of been the poor cousin. It's sort of like, we don't talk about that. Now we can talk about the metallic craft, if you like. We can talk about that all day. We could talk about declassified documents about Roswell or crashes. But but that's about as far as we're willing to go. The actual ETs themselves, or these beings themselves, certainly the abductions is an absolute no-no, and I think it will always, even with this alleged semi-disclosure that's coming, they are not going to touch the abduction phenomenon. Now, I have heard rumblings and I think a few one-liners within some of that declassified information and some of these reports where they talk about these craft taking human females. Now, I don't exactly know the context of that, but that's not going to be headline news. That's not going to be the headline on the news or on the front of the newspaper. And I suppose rightly so, really, because if that was the headline, then you can imagine the result of that. But nevertheless, I think that the witnesses and the contactees, I've always thought that that's where the information is. But because, as you said, these guys are such masters at what they do, the level of deceit is like 11. There is nothing like it. And even with some, using regression, which in itself is a difficult technique to sort of give any credence towards in certain circles, you need to be trained and understand that about that screen memory, the layers of screen memory, and that just because you've peeled back, a couple of screen memories of an owl and you found a grey alien, that is usually isn't it. But it takes the subject, it takes the abductee to be willing to want to see. And that's what Ted Rice in Masquerade of Angels was willing to do, because I can absolutely understand why you wouldn't want to go any further than the grey alien. And now, often behind the grey alien, in this order, is military personnel and then the reptile. That's usually the order that this comes in when you can get a person to commit to it. Now, after that, the experience takes a very negative turn in most cases. That's what my research and speaking to the people who I consider like really clued up on this, like James Bartley and his mentors, that's what they found. So I can completely understand why people would have a hard time accepting the information. Absolutely. And that's not, again, not to say there isn't a love and light aspect to this. It wouldn't be, I don't think the way the universe is created or the way reality is created, that wouldn't fit. So, I think you're right. I think there is duality there, at least.
Yeah, I also think just in terms of the alien beings, in terms of the ancient world, the angelic host was compartmentalized, and so you had tradition between human angels, and then you had tradition between non-human angels, and the non-human angels, which were the seraphim, were seen in conjunction with the human angels. And this is reported throughout the biblical texts and the apocrypha. So this is something which was understood. We also know that alien abduction occurred just in terms of Greek carvings, and so you have angelic beings stealing children. Also, you have chariots, like you'll have a chariot with a wheel with a serpent, which is representing the seraphic host, and then inside of the chariot you'll have children. So again, the implication is that children were being abducted or stolen. And so this is a theme which is running throughout the ancient world as well. So it's not just something which has just popped up now. And I think this is why ufology initially was very reluctant to look at abduction, because they thought, okay, we know that there's something in the sky, but that's just taking it too far. That's somebody's made that up. Where is the proof or the evidence? Well, I would say that the evidence is in the ancient world, and go and look at the text of the ancient world and it's all there. And so pretty much it's all translated from the ancient world into the modern world, and there is this occulted tradition from the ancient world which is found within ufology. And in actual fact, when you look at it and you deconstruct ufology, modern ufology is based upon the ancient scaphological traditions of these boats and vessels. And so that's something which is very interesting.
Yeah.
So is there anything which you would like to add before?
There is. There's a question I have for you, and I know we touched on it briefly, but what do you think the relationship is with the jinn? Are the jinn the serpents, or are the jinn something else? Because that's always fascinated me, and I know a lot of people will get into some debates about this.
Yeah, I think they're one and the same. So I think the seraphim and the jinn are one and the same. And in actual fact, the Arabic word jinn was often translated in the Hebrew as the seraph or seraphim, and the seraphim are the highest order of angels, which are said to be made from light. There are different interpretations what that actually means in terms of some Muslim scholars believe that means that they're made out of light or plasma, or that they're a spiritual being. They are said to be able to shapeshift and to change their form. I describe them as a holographic culture, that they've deconstructed the physical mechanics of reality, and so they can control thoughts, they can control the spiritual realm. Now, I guess the debate is whether this is technological or not.
Yes.
So that's the big one. Are they somehow manipulating reality through the mind, through the spirit realm and through ideas, or are they doing this through technology? My guess is that this is technologically based. But then again, as a man from the 21st century, that would be my kind of prejudice, because there's very little that we actually know. And so I'm looking at this from my perspective and my point of view, which seems to be very technological in terms of their wheels, in terms of their flying shields, in terms of how they can disappear from reality. With the jinn, as we mentioned earlier, they are also connected to Sirius as well. And I personally think that the symbology of light is a reference to Sirius. So that's not to say it's a reference to the fact that they're a holographic culture and that they can deconstruct the mechanics of reality, which is based on waveform photon reality. So that's one level, but the symbolism is where they originate from, which is Sirius, which is the shining one. So the serpent and Sirius are one and the same, and this interconnects with the jinn because they have deconstructed the different wavelengths of reality, and these wavelengths of reality are like musical chords. Pythagoras spoke about the Pythagorean monochord, where the deepest notes which resonate at the deepest level is physical matter, and at the higher level this is the spirit. Now they can do both. So this is why within UFO abduction, for example, people are taken through walls, because they can use sound and they can use vibration in order to deconstruct the molecular form of reality. The key to understanding this is sound and vibration. It comes back to sound and vibration, which then is connected in the Greek tradition to the logos, or the voice, which is basically the inception of the idea. The inception of the idea is the spiritual realm, which are all of the universes, which are actually beyond time. And so this again is this idea that time itself can be deconstructed, and that the soul itself is not limited to one time zone. It can be incarnated into different time zones and into different versions of the same reality, but a different version of the reality. So I think that these are very interesting ideas, and these are ideas that I've looked at in my work, but I haven't published, or I've published some of the ideas, but not all of the ideas. So it's a complicated question.
No, I think you're right. I think in terms of, I think with any religious book, of course, that you're going to get huge debate, and the same with, from what I understand about etymology as well. So that those sorts of debates are going to rage on forever. But as I think you said earlier in our conversation, that it isn't beyond the realm of belief that elements of the jinn, if they are the serpents, and they were moving into a very AI type technologically based civilization, maybe elements of them didn't want to do that. I mean, just look at us. There are a lot of us that really don't want to go down that road. We're being forced down that road right now. I think we're really at a crucial period in mankind's history, really, if you ask me, certainly in the next 10, 15 years, certainly where AI is concerned, and humanity and all the rest of it. But it's interesting. I mean, this really goes back to what you were saying there about the jinn and the creation and sound and perception. Just look at how perception is used now to create the world we're living in. So it's very similar. So obviously it's a little bit more crude, the way media is used and words are used now to construct our reality, because we're living in this this system. So no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's a lot we can take, and certainly from all elements of, you know, what I think my advice to people watching this who have only got one interest but really want to know more. So let's say you're only into nuts and bolts craft, or you're only into cryptids, or you're only into ancient history and cultures. I think it pays to do what you did and delve into those subject matters and read literature that you might never have picked up. Just read a lot, really. I think that's my advice for me. I mean, I work a lot of hours, and I'm also, one of the advantages I have is that I work for a company that we handle information from all sorts within the alternative media. So we do a lot of ancient history, and we do a lot of ufology. So I'm lucky enough. I'm not brilliant at retaining large chunks of information, but I take little bits from here and there, from different cultures and different people from every corner of the world, really, where all these accounts share that one similarity. Usually that similarity is the deceptive nature of these beings. So I think delving into other areas of research, and the other key thing is understanding the deceptive nature of this phenomena. And I say this phenomena because I don't want to lump the ETs in, you know, they're not the guys. They're not the only guys. As you said earlier, this phenomena shares that trait, whether it be the jinn, whether it be demons, whether it be cryptids, all this phenomena that may or may not have deconstructed reality, as you said, they all share this deceptive nature. Now, what is it they're hiding? So I think far too many people are, again, not to put too negative a point on this and to come over all negative, because that's one way that the mainstream ufological community ousted very good researchers. They said, well, your research is too negative for us. We don't want to hear it. And I think that, I mean, if you're going to do that, you're missing a huge chunk of information from and also that research, that kind of research is actually harder to do. It's very taxing mentally on you to be reading information that makes yourself uncomfortable, and to be in front of, and to be in the company of witnesses that have seen this sort of stuff firsthand. And I think a lot of armchair researchers who are purely trying to, James Bartley calls them gatekeepers of the community. They're still out there. These guys are still out there. There's not many of them left now. And the doors, you know, have kind of opened for a lot of young, I mean, there aren't that many young researchers in this genre. But yeah, I think there's a lot of pitfalls to be aware of in this subject, but there's also a lot of reward and fascinating information out there. So yeah, I love it, and I'm all eye up to keep doing it.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one last point, and then we'll talk about where you can actually get your DVDs from, which I do absolutely recommend, because they just are so in depth, and a lot of the information, as you said, is extremely specialized. But again, looking at the cryptoids and looking at the reptilian side, when you begin to factor in what is happening, there are a lot of similarities. And so it is a matter of looking at multidisciplines and piecing them together and looking at the information and correlating it and drawing conclusions from that.
Yes.
So that's extremely useful. You did mention about the negative side, and it did dawn on me, and this is what I found within my research, was that in terms of, in the ancient world, in terms of the emphasis on blood sacrifice, you would have the votive dishes, and the votive dishes were in the shape of a wheel. So you'd have a circle, and then you'd have a circle within a circle, which would be a wheel. And this would represent these angelic vessels, which were constructed from a series of cogs. And again was used for the hieroglyph of Sirius, as we said before, Sira, the shining one, Sira, which is a boat. So these wheels were boats, and they were used in terms of divination vessels and votive vessels. And so we do know that there is a connection with blood sacrifice, which goes all the way back into the ancient world. And there is this connection, and parts of this are very daunting, and parts of it are quite negative. But again, it's a mixture, and it's extremely complicated. And in terms of these beings, with one hand they've taken away from the world, and with another hand you have traditions of messengers and enlightened beings. And so it's a complicated picture, but of course we all need to be cognizant of the fact that these beings are very deceptive. And with that, we also have the deceptive priesthood as well. I refer to the priesthood who keeps this knowledge as the disciperati. And the word disciperati means to deceive, but is very closely related to the word disciple. So they are the disciples of deception. And they layer this information as well through symbology and through language and through etymology. And so that's something that I'm extremely interested in. So where can we get your DVDs from?
Yeah, my website is www.don'tmentionthereptilians.com. Quite original. I don't think you'll mistake that website for someone else's. And you can, the Bringing Down the Light, which is the film I made with Paul Sinclair, that we look at. The Bringing Down the Light is about a place called Bempton, which has every form of weird phenomena you can think of, from UFO landings to cryptids to lights in the sky to animal mutilation. So that movie can be found now. It can be found on a platform called Forbidden Knowledge. That's Forbidden Knowledge, and that's a platform run by a guy called Billy Carson. Some of you watching this might know him. So we put the movie on Billy's platform just to get it out there and get it seen by more, because obviously DVDs now, people we're getting into that age now where most people just want to stream media. Personally, I do like DVDs. I do like hard copies of things. Probably a bit, and again, a little bit of a Luddite, but that's I just like that. That's just what I prefer. But and we really do have people that are the same. People do tend to like having something in their hand. I suppose it's a bit like, remember the time when people said books would disappear, but no, because people still want the book in the hand. There's just something about having it in your hand. And sometimes, look, the internet's amazing, isn't it? And we just had to get to the point, streaming movies, where we can get our films, and other people like me can get our information out on a bigger scale, because YouTube, as I think we've discussed it before, I think eventually will sort of shut the door on this type of information, unless it suits what's going on in mainstream ufology.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for your time. It's been really enlightening. And again, you've answered a lot of questions that I had in terms of watching the films. I do recommend watching all of the films, because I just think that they're really fantastic, and I think that the information is extremely specialized. It's not the type of information you're going to really get unless you actually read very specialized books. And I think what you've managed to do is draw together lots of diverse researchers where there are these common threads, but the research is very diverse and very specialized. And so, if you're interested in interdimensional entities, if you're interested in portals, if you're interested in the jinn, if you're interested in the physical side as well, and again, not all of these researchers agree on what this is and how this relates. But what's fascinating about this is that you have all these different parts of the jigsaw, all of these really important pieces, and they can all be found in your work. And I think that that's what's really strong about your work. And I think that you're certainly one of the most prominent filmmakers in the UK at the moment, which is researching this and actually doing a really high quality job, just in terms of the visuals, the way in which it's edited, the cinematography in Bringing Down the Light and the EIusive was fantastic. And again, the storytelling within Don't Mention the Reptiles, and the story of this guy's journey meeting this reptilian being is really well edited and put together. So I have to commend you on your work, and I do recommend that my audience check out your work. Thank you again, Chris. It's been a fantastic interview. Thank you.
No, I loved it, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.